Hello everyone, welcome to the review session of Urban Economics. In this session, I'm going to give you a quick summary of the key knowledge points of this course. So the basic idea is to help you to get a good overview of what we have learned in this course. But as I said before, this cannot be a substitute for your own study with more details on your side. Okay, so let's just go to the topics. First topic in this course will be topic 1, that's the introduction. So in this chapter or in this topic, we said quite a number of things. For example, we started with the concept or definition of urban economics, but actually the first key knowledge point of this chapter or this topic is the 5 axioms of urban economics. So as I said before, I do not require you to recite the 5 axioms word by word in this part, but it's more important for you to understand the idea behind them and be able to provide intuition or examples. If I ask you, for example, what does it mean by externality causes inefficiency and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the first knowledge point. The second knowledge point of the introduction will be the spatial equilibrium. It's a very simple spatial equilibrium model. So it's just like to explain why the rent in the city centers tend to be more expensive than far away from the city center. So the key idea is just like for each household or each worker, you need to make a trade-off between rental payment and transportation cost. If you live closer to the city, the transportation cost is low, but you need to pay higher rent. And if you live further away from the city, you pay lower rent, but the transportation cost is higher. Okay. The third knowledge point of key knowledge point of this topic is reasons for trading cities to emerge. As we said, using the example of Singapore and Temasek in the lecture notes, the 3 most important conditions for trading cities to emerge are comparative advantage in production, economy of scale in exchange, and the travel cost should be smaller than the benefit from trading. Okay, and next to that, I showed you the models of different kinds of cities. So in general, we have production city, producing city, and innovation cities. And among them, in general, the model for production city will be the most important. So this kind of a so-called Martini glass graph. So in the lecture notes, we studied using the example of this kind of factory sarong and a homemade sarong, right? So basically, for each consumer, they can decide whether they buy sarong from the factory, if that's cheaper than their homemade sarong, or they produce it at home. So in general, if people live closer to the sarong factory, the total cost, which is more like the price of the sarong plus the traveling cost, uh, will be the smallest, because if they live just outside of the factory, the traveling cost is more or less zero. So that's more. So this price is like the stamp of the cost of buying sarong. And when they live further away from the factory, then because of the traveling cost, the total cost of buying sarong is higher. So that makes the more like uh, the total cost of getting sarong is increasing. And you should know that more like the slope of the Martini glass will be like the unit traveling cost for the consumers and so on. And you should also be able to calculate like the range of the Martini glass area, namely the range in which the consumers will buy the sarong from the factory instead of make the sarongs at home, or so-called market area of the factory in this part. And next to that, we also have this kind of a processing city. So a processing city is a little bit different from production city, because production city is more like the factories want to be closer to the consumers. Processing city will be more like the factories want to be closer to the source of materials and so on. And in this case, in general, the shape of to calculate the market area, the shape is more like an arrow, as we said before, instead of martini glass. And finally, we have innovation cities. So innovation cities, basically the consideration will be more like there is kind of a positive spillover between smart people, right? So when smart people are together, their production will increase. But at the same time, you may face congestion costs when too many people live together. So in general, the optimal size of the city will depend on the relative benefit of this knowledge spillover and the cost of congestion. So that will be the key idea behind the model of innovation cities. So that's basically for topic 1. And then we have topic 2. Topic 2 is very kind of a basic in this course because actually several later topics will use the knowledge in topic 2. So here we have the very important concept of agglomeration economies. So basically that just means that the production becomes more efficient when more firms stay together, right? When more firms stay together. So the first key knowledge point in this topic will be agglomeration economies in production. So there are 4 parts. So for these 4 points, you do need to remember because they are very, very important. You do need to, but instead of just reciting the words is also more important for the ideas behind them. But you do need to know all of them. So basically, they are production efficiency improvement due to sharing intermediate inputs, just like button makers and dressmakers, right? We have the example of button makers and dressmakers. And sharing labor pools. So in general, when more firms stay together, it will be more like more firms stay together. So basically, when they have increased demand, it's easier for them to get more people. And also, when they get more people, they do not need to pay too much more for each worker. So that's the sharing labor pools. And then we have better labor skill matching. That's something like we study using this circle model, right? Using this circle model. So in general, basically, when when more firms stay together, when the size of the city is larger, you have more workers. So in general, when the firms want to hire, then the training skill gap is also smaller for each worker, tend to be smaller, and that also saves the training cost. That's the idea of labor skill matching. And finally, you have knowledge spillover, just like also something similar to the innovation city part, right? So when you have more smart people together, when they talk to each other, it's also easier for them to get innovation in production. Okay, and after that, we also say that agglomeration economies have 2 forms, right? 2 forms: localization economies and urbanization economies. So in general, the 4 aspects of agglomeration economies is exactly the same. For the name is exactly the same for localization economies and urbanization economies. The difference is that localization economy is like what? It's like more for the same industry, but urbanization economies is more like for across different industries, right? Across different industries. So, and basically, you need to know that when I mention the agglomerate, for example, when I mention sharing intermediate inputs for localization economies, it means a different thing compared to the sharing intermediate inputs for urbanization economies. So localization economy will be more like the story for button maker and different dressmakers, right? But for urbanization economy, sharing intermediate inputs can be different firms from different industries. They share the intermediate service from the service industry. Let's say accountants or lawyers and so on and so forth. So you need to know that the different example for urbanization economies and urbanization economies is different. Okay, and after that we have topic 3. Topic 3 is called urban growth. So basically that just means what are the forces or factors that influence the growth of city, and in particular by growth we mainly mean the population growth, right? Like the determinants for the population size of a city. So that's for topic 3. Okay, so the first knowledge point we met in this topic is the size rank rule. So in general, the idea is just like, so if the population of the largest city in a country is kind of M, so then the second largest city will have a population of half M, and the third one will be like 1/3 or 1/3 of M, and so on and so forth. So just some brief idea. So like some people also call it CPUF rule, but it's just like some statistical property of the size rank. Okay, and the second one is basically how to model the utility of city residents depends on the size of the city. And in general, it will be something like inverse U shape, something like inverse U shape. So in general, this kind of utility curve always have two parts. So there's an upward sloping part where agglomeration economies increases more rapidly than congestion diseconomies. So basically, when more people are together, the benefit of agglomeration economies outweighs congestion cost, and there is also a downward sloping part, basically a decreasing part, where the congestion cost outweighs the benefit from agglomeration economies. That's the basic idea of the shape of the utility. And the third one is something we call multiplier effect. Multiplier effect is basically just like when you want to make an investment in a country. Let's say you build a factory in a country, so it creates some direct employment, right? So basically, because you want to invest in a country, then automatically you will need to hire people for working for the factory. But at the same time, we also say that when you hire these, let's say, workers, technicians, engineers for the factory, they will also need to buy a lot of things from local market, from local non-tradable goods market. For example, they need to buy glossaries or hairdressing service or all these kind of services. So basically, any investment in a place create both direct and indirect employment. And the multiplier effect basically describes the situation where when you create direct employment, you also create indirect employment. Okay, and the fourth knowledge point is about the impact of technological innovation in urban growth. In particular, we consider example in a two-city system, right? So at the beginning, the two cities are exactly the same. They also have the same equilibrium population size, but then suddenly one city got technological innovation, so the utility curve of the residents of the city shift kind of upwards, and after that, people in the city without that technological innovation also try to move to the city with a higher utility, and in equilibrium that also has some impact on the population size and the utility of the residents in the two cities. So that's more or less the graph you should look at. And finally, the fifth knowledge point of urban growth is something we call urban decline. So basically, we also look at the kind of a case study or example of Detroit in the US. So here we need to understand why housing price tend to decline very sharply when you have urban decline. So basically, the explanation we provided was more or less like because the supply curve of housing is kinked, housing is more elastically supplied when price increases, but when the price falls, it's more inelastic because it's harder to destroy houses, and you always have the stock of houses. So in this case, it's easier for you to have something like excess supply of housing, and that will make your housing price drop more compared to the case where the supply curve is not kinked or it's a completely continuous. So that will be the urban decline knowledge point of this chapter. Okay, so and then we can look at topic 4. Topic 4 is called land bid rents and land use decisions. So basically, as we said at the very beginning of this topic, the one very big question or one key question in this chapter or in this topic is to understand why both rent and building height of a monocentric city or of a city tend to increase sharply with the distance increases near the city center. Or in other words, just like when you look at each city, always like when you look at relatively far away from the city, the rent tend to be cheap, the building height tend to be low, and it tend to be flat for a long while. But when they gradually reach the city center, the rent and building height tend to increase exponentially. So that's the key pattern we want to explain in this topic. So, and in order to explain this, we introduced several models for land bid rents, starting from the agricultural one by Ricardo, right? And so the first simple bid rent model we have in this chapter is for manufacturers. And for this one, we basically just say that the bid rent for manufacturers tend to be a decreasing function of the distance from the highway. So because if you assume that manufacturers need to rely on the highway to transport their products to other parts of the country, then the transportation cost will be smallest or lowest when they are exact at the exit or entrance to the highway. And when they are further away from the highway, then the transportation cost increases linearly. So, and also we should know that the bid rent will be more like the profit of the bidder. So in this chapter, we always assume that the landowner is a kind of residual claimer. So the landowner has the market power. So landowner takes all the profit of production in the long run. And actually, the manufacturers or workers and this group of people, unfortunately, they are left with zero economic profit due to competition. So in this case, what you will see is that because the transportation cost is linear, so because that the transportation cost will increase linearly when you are further away from the highway, that means your profit will decrease in a linear way when you are further away from the highway. So that is why, because your willingness to pay for the land or willingness to bid is equal to your profit, that makes your bid rent also a decreasing line depending on the distance from the highway in the simple land bid model. Okay, and after that, we introduced nonlinear transportation cost for offices. So basically, in this part, remember, it's just like we have a city, right, where if for the office worker, they have to meet the office workers of all other offices in the city. And in this case, you may have more like a convex transportation cost. So you may have a nonlinear transportation cost. basically what it means is when you are every time when you are 1 unit further away from the city center, your transportation cost doesn't increase linearly but increase faster and faster. So that's the case for this one. But we also said an important point is that this nonlinear transportation cost for offices does not explain the nonlinear bid rent curve or the main pattern of the rent at the beginning of this chapter, because when you have nonlinear transportation cost, if there's a convex and increasing, if you calculate the bid rent curve, actually you need to just kind of remember we have this flip of the curve, and if you do the flip, actually the shape doesn't match. So in general, that's why we say that when you have nonlinear transportation, when you have this office building worker, they have nonlinear transportation cost. This part actually doesn't explain the nonlinearly increasing trend in rent and building heights at the beginning of this chapter. Okay, and after that, we introduced the fourth one called factor substitution and the developer optimization. So basically, in this case, the idea is that we allow the developers to use capitals to replace rent. And so the key idea will be that if you allow the developers to choose buildings of different heights, right? When you have a very tall building, that's very costly in terms of capital. But in general, that occupies a very small piece of land. When you have a low building, in general, that costs very low in terms of capital, but it occupies a larger piece of land. And if you allow the developers to choose the size of the land endogenously, then you will see that when it's closer to the city center, when the land rent is higher, the developer can optimally choose a smaller piece of land and use capital to replace the land. Namely, they can build much higher at the city center, and when they do that, they save the rent. And also because they can do this when they are closer to the city center, so they are also more willing to bid for the land. And as we said in the lecture, this point does help to explain the exponentially increasing rent and building heights when you reach the city center. So basically, that's a very important part of this topic. As we said, the nonlinear transportation cost doesn't explain the exponentially increasing building rent and building height, but factor substitution by developers does explain the building height and rent, exponentially increasing rent and building height at the city center. So that's the answer to the question at the beginning. Okay, and finally, we studied a situation where individual consumers choose between housing and non-housing good, and so the key idea is to explain why people tend to live in smaller places when they are in the city center. And in this case, you remember that we have this utility maximization problem. But as I said to you in the lecture, you don't need to be able to derive the solution to the utility maximization problem, but instead we have this condition where the marginal rate of substitution is equal to marginal rate of transformation. So it's just something like the marginal utility ratio between housing and non-housing good is equal to the relative price of housing, that's the rent, against the price of a non-housing good, that's actually normalized to 1. And you just need to know the intuition of the condition, which says that when rent becomes higher, then the marginal utility of housing tend to become higher compared to marginal utility of non-housing good, and because people so both goods are normal goods to people and they are both subject to diminishing marginal utility, then a higher marginal utility of housing actually implies that when people choose optimally, then they should choose a smaller amount of consumption of housing, which means that in the city center, they tend to live in smaller places. So that will be the case, that will be the knowledge point for topic 4. Okay, so after we discuss the topic 4, let's go for the key knowledge points for topic 5. So topic 5 is about monocentric city model and explain the urban land use patterns. So in this topic, one key pattern we want to explain is that why in modern cities we always have like circles of different industries of the city. For example, if you look at um, a normal monocentric city, you will always see that office industry or office sector tend to be in the city center, and then the next layer will be like for the manufacturers, and then for the next layer or circle will be for the residential sector, and finally you will see the agriculture sector. So basically, as we saw in the basic model of this chapter, the reason is that the bid rent of a different industry is different. So in general, you can say that because the bid rent for office sector tend to be very high and very steep, so they can outbid other sectors in the city center, so they tend to be in the city center. And then you have manufacture. They have the second highest and the second steepest bidding curve, so they are in the second layer, and so on and so forth. So that's the basic model to explain the monocentric city, the pattern in the monocentric city. And then the second knowledge point of this chapter is the general equilibrium effect of the invention of new transportation technology. So basically, we have this nice model of two sectors, just the business and the residential area, right? So you can look in more detail for this model. So the key idea is that for general equilibrium model, there can be different waves of effect. So it's not just a one shot or one round of effect, but it can be multiple waves of effect. And in this case, in this model per se, we just consider two waves, right? So in general, when you have a new transportation technology, that always helps you to reduce commuting costs of workers. And when you reduce the commuting costs of the workers, the bid rent curve for the workers tend to be higher than before, right? So in that case, you in the first wave, you will have more workers who can live and work in the city, and basically the residential area should increase in the first wave, right? And then we also say that we should not just stop in the first wave, because when you have larger residential area, when you have more workers, actually the labor supply will increase, and when labor supply increase and labor demand is more or less the same, you will generally see the salary should decrease a little bit. And when the salary decreases a little bit, that actually causes a decrease in the bid rent curve of the workers, and hence kind of a small shrink of the residential area. And because of and also because the salary is lower, actually that might also help to improve the profit of the business sector. And in that case, the business area can also increase a little bit. So this is just a nice example for you to understand how the one shock or one kind of one event can cause different waves of effect in an economic system in a general equilibrium model. So you should really know the idea of general equilibrium in this case. Basically, the idea is just when something happens, then there can be first and second wave of effects and so on. Okay. And the third key knowledge point of topic 5 is urban sprawl. So basically, you just need to know that the general idea of urban sprawl is that after the Second World War, you will see that actually the density of people and the economic activity in urban area, especially in central area, tend to decrease in many American cities. And there can be several potential reasons for that, among which you can say that because most American families already have their own private cars now, so the transportation cost is not too big a concern for them. But at the same time, for many of them, they still the space, living space is still a normal good for them. So they still want to live in larger house. And in such a case, then living in a crowded place in the city center may not be a very good idea. So more and more family will prefer to live in relatively more spacious suburb areas and so on. Okay, that will be for topic 5. And then we have topic 6. Topic 6 is about neighborhood choice and peer effect. So there are basically 3 key knowledge points in this topic. The first one is like the median voter theorem. So as we said, why there are different neighborhoods, one potential reason is that people have different preferences for public good, and people with the same preference for the public good tend to live together, because otherwise if let's say I'm a person who who doesn't care about a park, but I live in a place with a very big park, actually I will find it quite inefficient and so on. But if people of all kinds live together, then according to median voter theorem, you will always see that they will choose something like a medium level of public good, and in such a case, the high type and low type may not want to live in the neighborhood, and they may want to form their own neighborhood. So that's the first, more or less the first point. And the second key knowledge point of this chapter is relatively more important than the other two. So we studied how neighborhood rental premiums will influence the outcome in terms of the segregation and pooling. Okay, so we use the example of just say rich people and poor people, but it's not restricted to rich and poor, but any two kinds of people, right? So in our basic model, we just assume that everyone prefers to live with rich people, both rich and poor people prefer to live with rich people. Then whether we will have segregation or pooling or mixed equilibrium will just depend on the different shape of rental premiums of the rich and poor. So in general, I think it's not difficult to think of or to imagine that if the rental premium is always higher for the rich compared to the poor, namely rich people are always more willing to pay for living with other rich people compared to the poor people, then it's more likely to have segregation, because whenever a neighborhood is with more rich people, then both rich and poor people want to move in, but rich people can always outbid the poor people. So in the end, this neighborhood will become a pure rich neighborhood and so on. And on the other hand, to the contrary, if the rental premium is always higher for the poor people compared to the rich people, you will see pooling, because whenever some neighborhood starts with more rich people, you will see that both rich and poor people want to move to this neighborhood, but actually poor people is going to win, and this will actually offset the initial more rich people in that neighborhood. And finally, if you see the kind of there is an intersection between rental premiums of the rich and poor, you will see mixed equilibrium. So that's more or less the idea of this point. And after that, we also study something like minimum lot size zoning and segregation. So in this part, the key idea is what we say is that sometimes the policies with good purpose may not lead to good result. Namely, we say that so if there's no zoning law or no minimum lot size zoning, then actually poor people can always try to enter a rich neighborhood by living in a relatively smaller place in the rich neighborhood. Basically, it just says that if poor people really want to live in a rich neighborhood and if there's no restriction on the size of the house, then they can always try to be there by living in a relatively smaller place. And in this case, if the government introduce something like minimum lot size zoning, namely the government think that we want to protect people, so we wouldn't allow people to live in a small place, actually that even though the policy has a good purpose, but actually that will harm the poor people's opportunity to enter the rich neighborhood to get positive externality. And in the long run, that will help to make segregation between rich and poor, and that may not be a good outcome for the poor people. So that's the idea of the relation between minimum lot size zoning and segregation. Okay, that's for topic 6. And after that, we studied topic 8. Topic 8 is about urban transport. So in this topic, we look at 3 key knowledge points. So the first one is about the externality of transport or externality of driving in general. And I think this point is the first point is not too hard to follow. So the basic idea is just you have the problem of congestion in the city because there is a negative externality between the drivers, and uh, because uh, when a driver decides whether he or she want to enter the road, he will not consider the fact that he goes on the road will make extra like congestion or delay of other drivers. So in this case, what we say is his private marginal cost is below the social marginal cost of driving. And in such a case, it's always easy to have too many cars on the road. And in this situation, a congestion tax is always good for the society because a congestion tax, as long as it's optimally designed, will help to make private costs and private marginal costs and social marginal costs of driving equal to each other, and hence to make the situation more efficient. Okay. And the second part, I mentioned this is more like a case study or a story. We said that in America, people find a puzzling fact which says that when you force the drivers to install car safety measures on their cars, actually it doesn't reduce the car accident numbers, and to make things worse, it causes larger damage or injury for pedestrians and cyclists involved in a traffic accident. And in this case, one explanation from researchers basically says like when you ask the drivers to install car safety measures on their vehicle, on their automobiles, then so before they have the safety measures, since they know that when they have an accident, they are going to suffer from damage or injury themselves, then probably they will tend to drive more carefully and slowly. But when you have better protection for them, better safety measures for them, they probably will not suffer a lot from injuries, even if there's an accident. So in this case, actually they will tend to drive faster and more careless. And because of that, they will, because they are driving faster and in a more careless way, then that will actually lead to more accidents, and because they are driving faster, so they can also cause more injuries on the pedestrians and cyclists if there is an accident. Okay. The third key knowledge point of this chapter is about the trip cost model. So basically, that is trying to explain why high-income people use private auto and taxi more compared to the public transport, even though the difference in the cost or the price can be about 10 times. Namely, it can be the case that private auto costs 10 times more than public transport. So the explanation we have from this topic will be that because people do not like access time, namely the traveling cost of a trip consists of a monetary cost, right? Consists of a monetary cost and access time. That's the time when you go from your home to parking place or from your home to bus stop, and in-vehicle time. And it's a reasonable assumption that people have the largest disutility for the access time. And in such a case, because private auto always has a much smaller access time compared to public transport, so high-income people will always prefer to use private auto to try to minimize the access time. So that's for topic 8, the key knowledge points for topic 8. Okay. So finally, there is topic 9. Topic 9 is about housing market. So in this part, first, we say that what is so different about the housing good, or why is housing different? So we mentioned 4 differences between housing good and non-housing good. First, it's a heterogeneous bundle good. Namely, when you want to buy a house, it's not just like the size of the house you care of. You also care about, for example, the model of the house, whether it's well designed or not well designed, or whether it's on the high floor or low floor, whether it's close to a park or close to a good school or not, and so on and so forth. You can see there are many things when you want to buy a house. So house is really kind of a bundled good. And the second is housing decision usually have significant transaction costs. So basically, when we say this, it means that if you want to buy a house or if you want to move from one house to another house, there is a pretty large transaction cost. For example, there can be agency costs. You need to hire a housing agency to find a place. You also need to go there to have a look yourself, right? And then there is also moving cost or refurnishing cost and so on and so forth. So for all of these, housing goods tend to have larger transaction costs than other goods. Okay. And third part is housing is a durable good, and hence there are 2 markets working simultaneously. So basically, you have both the rental market and the purchase market, right? And we have this famous model, what we call tenure choice, which means that people choose between renting and purchasing a house. When renting is relatively cheaper, so they decide to rent. When purchasing is relatively cheaper than renting, then they decide to buy. In equilibrium, you should have the case that there's a kind of a parity between the 2 markets, which means that the purchase price of the house should be equal to the present value of the dividend of house or the rent or future rents of the house for living in it. And the last part is housing good is also an investment asset. So basically, some of the times people buy houses not only for the purpose to live in it, they could also be for the purpose that they want to resell it later, such that they can earn a profit by making such an investment. Okay. And the second key knowledge point of this chapter is how do transaction costs affect housing decision. So basically we say that because the transaction cost is very high for a housing market, so that means most people wouldn't adjust their housing consumption very frequently, because it's not like for other kinds of goods. When you earn more income, you can always try to buy more or buy better this kind of goods. But for housing, it will be like, let's say if you get a small salary increase, even if you want to buy a larger place, but let's say you need to face 10,000 moving costs when you switch from your current house to another house, then probably you would not move to another place or start thinking of moving to another place unless your salary increase is very, very big, which is larger than the moving cost. Okay, and the third point is actually we already said something about it before. So the third knowledge point is quite related to the point C of knowledge point A, knowledge point 1. So because housing is a durable good, because people can either rent or buy their houses, so there's a tenure choice model. People can switch or choose between buying and purchasing. Buying and renting, and hence in equilibrium, buyers should be indifferent between purchasing and renting, and the purchase price should be equal to the present value of the future rental payment. Okay, and finally, we briefly mentioned the factors that may influence the emergence of housing bubbles. First, called boundary rationality, which basically says some of the times people do not have rational expectation about the future. They may have wrong perception or wrong expectation of the market price. They may be over optimistic, or they may chase the trend too much. They may become a trend chaser and trend too much. And second one is the supply elasticity. As we said, so in general, when housing supply is more elastic, then it's less likely to have a housing bubble. So because when the housing supply is more elastic, whenever there is a price increase, then the builders will build more, and that will lead to a decrease in the price. And C is the demographic factors. So basically, when you have a larger, let's say, baby boom, or when you have a larger increase in the population and the purchasing age, then you tend to have a higher housing price. And D is a policy and legal environment. For example, I think I briefly mentioned this non-recourse law in some of the American states, because the borrowers of a mortgage can walk away from their houses without punishment. So the banks cannot chase them for more payment when they default on the mortgage. That may lead to excess speculation by the buyers and hence more housing bubbles and crashes. And I also present some evidence for this thing. And finally, of course, we have income. So basically, you will see that nowadays in many Asian countries, the housing prices are increasing. For example, in China and India. So some people are worried about the bubbles, but you could also say that because these countries are still developing and the income is increasing very fast, so some of the times the increasing housing price can be just a natural result of increased income of the people. Okay, so I think having this said, that will be also we covered all the points for topic 9. So that's basically the points we want to discuss in this review session. So yeah, so that's basically it for the review session, and I just wish all of you all the best for the for the preparation for the exam. So the best outcome for you, and okay, so thank you, and see you.